Outside the walls of Isfahan in the year 1387, a mathematician stands before a growing structure that his own soldiers are building at his personal order, and he watches it rise with the same careful attention he brings to reviewing a ledger of tribute payments. The structure is a tower, and it is being built from human skulls, 70,000 of them, taken from the population of a city that had the misfortune to rebel against a tax collector he had installed months earlier. The mathematician's name is Timur, known to the terrified chroniclers of Europe and Asia as Tamerlane, a corruption of the Persian Timur-i-Lang, Timur the Lame, a reference to the injuries in his right leg and arm that never fully healed after a youth spent as a bandit and mercenary in the fractured, lawless steppe world of 14th century Central Asia. What the chroniclers who invent the legend of an unstoppable barbarian rarely explain, and what the Tower of Skulls itself conceals beneath its horror, is that the man ordering its construction is not simply a destroyer. He is, in the most literal and calculated sense available to a 14th century ruler, an economic engineer, and the massacre at Isfahan is not blind rage. It is a message, priced and delivered with the same precision he applies to every other transaction of his 40-year career. Rebellion against the trade network. I am rebuilding costs exactly this much, and I will collect the payment from every city that tests the calculation. Timur is born around 1336 near the city of Kesh, south of Samarkand, into a minor noble family of the Barlas tribe, a Turkicized Mongol lineage that has held modest local authority in Transoxiana, the fertile river valley territory between the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, in what is now Uzbekistan. Since the fragmentation of the Chagatai Khanate, one of the 4 successor states into which Genghis Khan's empire had split more than a century earlier. This fragmentation is the central fact of the world Timur is born into, and understanding it is essential to understanding everything he subsequently builds. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century had, for a period of roughly 100 years, achieved something no political system before or since has managed at comparable scale. They had unified the entire length of the Silk Road, from China to the Mediterranean, under a series of interlocking Mongol successor states that, whatever their internal rivalries, generally guaranteed safe passage, standardized taxation, and predictable commercial law across a trade network that connected the workshops of China to the markets of Europe. Contemporary observers, including the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, describe this period, the Pax Mongolica, as one in which a merchant could travel from one end of the known world to the other under a single, if brutally imposed, system of order. By the time of Timur's birth, that order has substantially collapsed. The 4 Mongol Khanates have fractured further into competing successor states. Plague has devastated trade populations across the entire route, following the Black Death's transmission along these same commercial corridors in the 1340s, and the safe, standardized transit that had defined the Pax Mongolica has degraded into a patchwork of rival tolls, unpredictable banditry, and commercial insecurity that makes long-distance trade along the classical Silk Road routes dramatically more expensive and dangerous than it had been a century earlier. Transoxiana itself, Timur's home region, sits at one of the most commercially critical junctions of this fractured network, the point where routes from India, China, Persia, and the Russian steppe converge. And its political fragmentation into competing local khans and tribal chieftains means that this critical commercial junction is, for most of Timur's early life, controlled by no single authority capable of guaranteeing the security that commerce requires. Timur's rise through this fractured landscape follows the classical pattern of steppe political consolidation. Alliance, betrayal, marriage into more prestigious lineages, and the patient accumulation of military force through a combination of raiding, mercenary service, and the absorption of defeated rivals' followers into his own growing retinue. He suffers the injuries that will define his epithet during this period, most likely from arrow wounds sustained while raiding in Sistan in the 1360s, wounds that leave him permanently lame in his right leg and with limited use of his right arm for the remainder of his life. A physical vulnerability that he will spend the following 4 decades ensuring no one mistakes for a limitation on his capacity for command. By 1370, having eliminated or subordinated every significant rival in Transoxiana, Timur declares himself the restorer of the Chagatai Khanate, ruling formally in the name of a puppet Khan descended from Genghis Khan's line, since Timur himself, lacking Genghis Khan's direct bloodline, can never claim the title of Khan in his own right, under the political theology that still governs legitimacy across the post-Mongol world. He rules instead as Amir, a lesser title that nonetheless commands, through his own accumulated military and political power, an authority that the nominal Khans he installs never meaningfully exercise. What Timur builds from this base over the following 35 years of continuous campaigning is not, despite the conventional framing of his career as an endless sequence of massacres, primarily a project of destruction. It is a project of commercial consolidation, pursued through methods that are genuinely and extraordinarily brutal, but whose underlying logic becomes clear only when his campaigns are read against the map of the fractured Silk Road he inherited, rather than against the map of religious or ethnic conflict that later chroniclers, particularly those writing in the traditions of his conquered Persian and Indian territories, prefer to emphasize. Samarkand, the city Timur makes his capital, is the clearest physical evidence of what he is actually trying to build. Rather than simply extracting wealth from conquered territories and consuming it, Timur directs an enormous proportion of the plunder from every campaign, the gold, the silver, but more distinctively the skilled craftsmen, architects, scholars, and artisans of every city he conquers, back to Samarkand, where he commissions a building program of staggering scale and ambition. Architects and tile workers deported from Damascus, weavers and metalworkers from Persia, masons from India, and scholars and astronomers from across the conquered territories are relocated, sometimes willingly and sometimes by force, to a city that Timur is deliberately transforming from a regional trading post into the most architecturally magnificent capital in the Islamic world. The Bibi Kanyam Mosque, the Guri Amir Mausoleum, the Shah-e Zinda necropolis, and the observatory later completed by his grandson Ulugh Beg are not incidental byproducts of Timur's conquests. They are, in a very direct sense, the point of the conquests. Samarkand is being built as the deliberate replacement capital for a Silk Road network whose previous organizing centers, whether Mongol Karakoram or the various Persian and Central Asian cities that had previously anchored regional trade, no longer function as reliable hubs. This pattern of forced relocation of skilled labor and craft knowledge, what a modern economist might recognize as an aggressive, coercive form of technology and expertise transfer, repeats across every major campaign of Timur's career and represents one of the most systematic wealth extraction strategies of the pre-modern world, distinct from the simpler plunder and burn pattern often attributed to steppe conquerors. When Timur sacks Delhi in 1398, following a campaign into northern India conducted with a brutality that contemporary chroniclers describe in genuinely horrifying detail, including the reported massacre of tens of thousands of Indian prisoners before the final assault on the city. The destruction is accompanied by the systematic deportation of the city's most skilled stoneworkers and craftsmen back to Samarkand, where their techniques visibly influence the architectural style of Timur's subsequent building projects. When he conquers Damascus in 1401, following a campaign against the Mamluk Sultanate, the city's renowned metalworkers and glassmakers are similarly relocated, and Damascus itself, once one of the most important manufacturing centers of the Islamic world, never fully recovers its former commercial and artisanal preeminence, a decline that some economic historians directly attribute to the loss of the specialized craft knowledge that Timur's deportations stripped from the city in a single campaign. The campaign against the Ottoman Empire, culminating in the Battle of Ankara in 1402, represents perhaps the clearest demonstration of the commercial logic underlying Timur's military strategy, because the Ottomans at this point in their history represent the single greatest rival threat to the trade network Timur is attempting to rebuild under his own control. Sultan Bayezid I has spent the preceding decade aggressively expanding Ottoman control over Anatolia and the Balkans, absorbing the Silk Road's western termini and the overland routes connecting Central Asia to the Mediterranean and European markets. A unified Ottoman state controlling these western termini represents, from Timur's position as the aspiring restorer of Silk Road commercial unity, an intolerable rival concentration of exactly the kind of trade route control that Timur has spent 3 decades assembling for himself further east. The catastrophic Ottoman defeat at Ankara, where Timur's forces rout Bayezid's army and capture the Sultan himself, who dies in captivity within months, does not merely humiliate a rival power. It shatters Ottoman control over Anatolia for over a decade, delaying by roughly 50 years the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople that will eventually occur in 1453, and it reopens the overland trade corridors through Anatolia to commercial flows that Timur's own network, rather than an increasingly centralized Ottoman customs and toll system, can capture and tax. The economic infrastructure Timur builds to actually capture and administer the commercial revenue flowing through his reconsolidated territory is as sophisticated, in its own context, as the military campaigns that create the territorial conditions for it. Timur reduces and standardizes the tolls and transit taxes along the major trade routes under his direct control, a policy that appears, on its surface, to contradict the image of an insatiably rapacious conqueror. But that makes complete sense once the underlying commercial strategy is understood. A merchant facing standardized, predictable, and moderate transit costs along a Timurid-controlled route, protected by Timurid military force from the banditry that plagues rival, less secure routes, will choose that route over less secure alternatives, even at a comparable or slightly higher toll rate, because the security premium, the reduced risk of catastrophic loss to raiders, makes the total expected cost of the journey lower. Timur is not merely extracting maximum short-term revenue from every transaction he can reach. He is competing, in a genuinely commercial sense, for the recurring transit business of the merchant class whose continued participation in his trade network is the entire long-term point of the military campaigns that establish and defend it. Clavijo, a Castilian ambassador sent by King Henry III of Castile to Timur's court at Samarkand in 1403 and 1404, leaves one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the commercial reality behind Timur's capital, describing a city whose markets overflow with goods from China, India, Russia, and the Middle East, whose merchant quarters house traders from across the known world, and whose court ceremony is designed with explicit theatrical intent to project an image of Samarkand as the wealthiest and most commercially central capital on earth. Clavijo's account, along with the accounts of other diplomatic missions from Ming China, the Mamluk Sultanate, and various Central Asian and Persian courts that regularly exchange embassies with Timur throughout his reign, confirms that Timur's court functions not merely as a military headquarters, but as an active node in ongoing diplomatic and commercial relationships across the entire Eurasian trading world. Relationships that a purely destructive conqueror, interested only in plunder rather than in the ongoing commercial productivity of a rebuilt trade network, would have no particular reason to cultivate with such evident care. The massacres, when they occur, and they occur with a frequency and scale that make any attempt to fully rehabilitate Timur's historical reputation an exercise in selective evidence, follow a pattern that, however morally indefensible by any reasonable standard, is commercially rather than randomly motivated in almost every documented case. Cities that submit to Timur's authority, pay the tribute and taxes he demands, and accept the administrative and commercial integration into his network are generally, though not universally, spared the wholesale destruction visited on cities that resist, rebel after initial submission, or that Timur judges to represent a continuing threat to the stability of the trade corridors he is trying to secure. The Tower of Skulls at Isfahan follows a rebellion against Timurid tax collectors, a direct challenge to the fiscal authority on which his entire commercial reconstruction project depends, and one that, left unpunished, would signal to every other city in his expanding domain that resistance to Timurid taxation carries no meaningful consequence. The scale of the punishment is calibrated not merely to punish Isfahan, but to broadcast, across every trade route and merchant network in Central Asia, exactly what the cost of testing Timurid authority will be, a form of terror that functions, however monstrously, as a commercial deterrence strategy, rather than as undirected destructive rage. Baghdad suffers a similarly calculated fate in 1401, sacked with extraordinary brutality after resisting Timurid authority, its population massacred in numbers that some contemporary and near-contemporary sources place in the tens of thousands, its famous canal and irrigation infrastructure damaged in ways that contribute to the city's long economic decline from its previous status as one of the greatest cities of the medieval Islamic world. The destruction of Baghdad's irrigation system in particular illustrates the limits and internal contradictions of Timur's broader commercial strategy. A punitive campaign calculated to terrorize potential rebels into submission can also, when its violence extends to the physical infrastructure that sustains a region's agricultural and commercial productivity, permanently damage the very economic capacity that a rebuilt trade network depends on. Baghdad never fully recovers the commercial and demographic preeminence it held before Timur's sack, a decline that persists for centuries and that represents, from the narrow perspective of Timur's own stated project of restoring Silk Road commercial vitality, a genuine strategic failure rather than merely a moral catastrophe. Timur's death in February 1405 occurs not in battle, but on campaign, at the town of Otrar in the depths of a Central Asian winter, as he leads an enormous army, reportedly 200,000 men, on what he intends as the culminating campaign of his career. The conquest of Ming China, the single remaining major power whose control over the eastern terminus of the Silk Road lies outside his authority, and whose subjugation would have completed, in Timur's own apparent conception of his life's work, the full restoration of a unified Eurasian trade network under a single political authority for the first time since the height of the Mongol Empire more than a century earlier. He dies of illness, likely a combination of age, the cumulative effect of decades of campaigning injuries, and an acute infection contracted during the brutal winter march before the invasion of China can begin, and the campaign is abandoned entirely by his successors within weeks of his death. What follows his death demonstrates, with a clarity that the conquests themselves sometimes obscure, exactly how personal and how dependent on Timur's own individual authority the entire commercial military system he constructed had actually been. The Timurid Empire fragments almost immediately among his sons and grandsons, who fight a series of internal succession wars that never fully reconstitute the unified territorial control Timur had achieved. Samarkand remains a major regional capital, and under Timur's grandson Ulugh Beg, becomes for several decades one of the most important centers of astronomical and mathematical scholarship in the Islamic world. But the empire-wide commercial integration that Timur had spent 35 years assembling through conquest, standardized taxation, and forced relocation of craft expertise does not survive as a unified political economic system beyond the first generation of his successors. The Silk Road itself, moreover, is entering a period of accelerating long-term decline that no amount of Timurid administrative reconstruction could ultimately have reversed, as the maritime trade routes that Portuguese, and later other European, navigators are beginning to develop around Africa, and eventually across the Atlantic and Pacific, will, over the following century and a half, progressively displace overland Eurasian trade as the dominant channel through which the most valuable long-distance commerce of the world economy flows. Timur's historical reputation, split between the terrifying destroyer remembered in Persian, Arabic, Indian, and eventually European chronicles, and the sophisticated patron of architecture and commerce, visible in the archaeological and diplomatic record of his own court, reflects a genuine tension in what he actually built, rather than a simple contradiction between propaganda and reality. He was, simultaneously, and without apparent internal contradiction from his own perspective, one of history's most effective builders of commercial infrastructure and one of history's most prolific mass killers, and the relationship between these two aspects of his career was not incidental, but structural. The trade network he rebuilt was rebuilt through terror precisely because terror, applied with calculated and well-publicized ferocity against cities that resisted or rebelled, was the mechanism by which a steppe warlord with no dynastic claim to Genghisid legitimacy could impose across an enormous and fractured territory the kind of security and predictable authority that long-distance commerce requires to function. The Tower of Skulls outside Isfahan and the astronomical observatory his grandson would later build in Samarkand are not contradictory monuments to two different men. They are the terror and the commerce of a single, coherent, if morally catastrophic, economic project, built by a lame bandit's son who spent 4 decades trying to become, through whatever methods the fractured world he inherited made available to him, the man who put the Silk Road back together.